For the first time in recorded history, the name Jerusalem appears not in myth or legend, but in written correspondence. It is the year 1350 BCE, and across the deserts of Canaan, small hilltop towns cling to rocky ridges. These towns are little more than fortified villages. Yet, each is a player in a fragile network of alliances, obligations, and survival under the shadow of Egypt, the regional superpower of the Late Bronze Age. Among them, a settlement called Jerusalem rises quietly on a ridge south of what would later become the Temple Mount. It is here, in a series of clay tablets later discovered in Amarna, Egypt, that the city first enters the historical record. The letters, sent to Pharaoh Akhenaten, are urgent, almost desperate. They are written by Abdi-Heba, a local ruler who governs Jerusalem and its neighboring towns. He writes not with the arrogance of a king, but with the fear of a man aware that his city could vanish if ignored. The Habaru, a term in the text referring to nomadic raiders and social outcasts, threaten the fragile peace of the region. Abdi-Heba pleads for Egyptian soldiers to defend his city, stressing that without Pharaoh's intervention, the town and its people will be overrun. The letters are more than administrative notes. They are a cry for survival, a glimpse into the anxieties and precariousness of life in Canaan during this period. Archaeology confirms much of what these letters imply. Excavations on the ridge of the city of David reveal fortified walls, large stone structures, and evidence of dwellings that suggest a small but organized urban center. Its population may have been only a few thousand, but its strategic location gave it disproportionate importance. Positioned between the coastal plains to the west and the Jordan Valley to the east, Jerusalem was a natural crossroads for trade and military movements. Control of the city meant influence over routes that connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant, a prize any power, large or small, would value. The society of Jerusalem was shaped both by Canaanite traditions and by the demands of Egyptian overlordship. Local rulers like Abdi-Heba held a delicate balance of authority. They were autonomous enough to govern daily life, collect tribute, and defend their towns, yet dependent on the pharaoh's military support. The Late Bronze Age in Canaan was characterized by such a patchwork of city-states, each bound by diplomacy, marriage alliances, and intermittent conflict. Jerusalem was one such city, vulnerable yet resilient. Life in 14th century BC, Jerusalem was defined by subsistence, trade, and ritual. Archaeological finds suggest that residents cultivated wheat, barley, and olives, raised goats and sheep, and relied on cisterns and water channels for survival on the rocky ridge. Pottery fragments, storage jars, and tools provide a window into daily existence. Meals prepared, grain stored, wine pressed. Religion, too, was central. Canaanite temples and altars have been found nearby, indicating that the city's inhabitants worshipped a pantheon of deities and sought divine favor in both agriculture and warfare. Yet the city was not insulated. The letters reveal constant threats: the Habaru raiders, rival city-states, and the ever-looming influence of Egypt. Abdi-Heba's pleas illustrate the tension between local governance and imperial oversight. He writes repeatedly that his city is loyal, yet he fears abandonment. These letters are remarkable not only for the historical data they provide, but also for the human voice that emerges across 3 millennia. One can almost hear the anxiety in the clay tablets, the worry of a ruler who knows that the fate of his people depends on distant power. Throughout the Late Bronze Age, Jerusalem remained a small, fortified town, yet its story during this period sets the stage for everything that follows. Its walls, its location, and its emerging identity as a center of administration and ritual would later make it the choice of King David as the capital of a united Israel. But for now, Jerusalem was just one of many Canaanite towns, surviving amidst the turbulence of imperial ambitions, local rivalries, and the shifting tides of population and culture. Even in these earliest mentions, the themes that would define Jerusalem for millennia are visible: strategic importance, religious significance, and the precarious balance between survival and destruction. The letters of Abdihiba are a testament to a city already aware of its fragile centrality, a city whose story, though modest at the time, would echo through empires, religions, and centuries to come. By the end of this period, around 1000 BCE, Jerusalem had survived as a small but resilient urban center. Its fortifications had withstood raids. Its rulers had navigated the treacherous waters of local and imperial politics. Yet this is only the beginning. Soon, a new power would rise within its walls, one that would transform the city from a small Canaanite town into the capital of a kingdom and the spiritual heart of a people. But for now, we remember the Jerusalem of the Amarna Letters, a city perched on a ridge, caught between loyalty and survival, speaking to Pharaoh across the deserts of time and entering history for the first time. Around the year 1000 BCE, the small hilltop town of Jerusalem underwent a transformation that would define its place in history. According to biblical sources, this was the moment when King David of the Israelites captured the city from its Canaanite inhabitants, the Jebusites. Archaeological evidence supports a period of urban expansion and fortification in Jerusalem during this time, though the precise nature of David's conquest is debated among scholars. Nevertheless, the narrative captures a shift in political and cultural importance. Jerusalem moved from being a minor Canaanite settlement under Egyptian influence to the capital of a nascent kingdom. David's choice of Jerusalem was strategic. Nestled atop a ridge between the Kidron and Tyropoeon valleys, the city was naturally defensible. Unlike other Israelite towns, it lacked an entrenched tribal allegiance, which made it a politically neutral ground for uniting the Israelite tribes. David established his royal residence on what would later be called the City of David, initiating monumental projects of fortification and administration. The city became the central hub for governance, diplomacy, and the growing religious institutions that would anchor the Israelite identity. The reign of David's son, Solomon, marked another transformation. Around 960 BCE, Solomon undertook the construction of the first temple, the House of Yahweh, on the elevated platform that had long been a sacred site. Archaeological and textual evidence indicate that the temple was modest by modern expectations, but symbolically enormous. Its centralized religious authority, codified ritual practice, and solidified Jerusalem as a spiritual center for the Israelite people. The temple served not only as a place of worship, but as a political tool, reinforcing the king's legitimacy and uniting a diverse population under a common religious framework. Jerusalem during this period was more than a political and religious center. It was a cultural and economic hub. Excavations reveal administrative structures, storage complexes, and evidence of trade extending from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan Valley, indicating the city's integration into regional networks. The population, though still small relative to the great cities of Egypt or Mesopotamia, likely numbered in the tens of thousands, enough to support a functioning monarchy and a priesthood managing the temple's rites. The city's inhabitants engaged in agriculture, animal husbandry, and artisan crafts, sustaining a society whose rhythms were dictated by both the land and sacred observances. Yet Jerusalem's rise was shadowed by the threats of the larger empires around it. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Assyrian Empire had emerged as a dominant force in the Near East. Assyrian kings conducted campaigns to extract tribute and assert dominance over the Levant. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib laid siege to Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah. According to the biblical account, the city was miraculously spared, but archaeological evidence suggests significant fortifications were in place, including broad walls and complex water systems, such as the Siloam Tunnel designed to secure the city's water supply against invaders. This episode underscores Jerusalem's dual identity as both a spiritual and military stronghold, a city that could inspire faith while withstanding siege. The city's ultimate test came from the rising power of Babylon. Following the decline of Assyria, Babylon emerged under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II, whose ambitions extended across the Levant. By 586 BCE, after a prolonged siege, Babylonian forces captured Jerusalem. The destruction was comprehensive. The first temple was burned, the city's walls demolished, and a large portion of the population deported to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian exile. This event was catastrophic not only politically, but also culturally and religiously. The temple, central to national and spiritual identity, was reduced to rubble. Civic administration collapsed, and Jerusalem ceased to function as a capital city. Yet, even in destruction, Jerusalem's identity endured. The exile fostered a period of intense reflection and codification of religious texts, as Jewish scholars sought to preserve laws, traditions, and memories tied to the city and its temple. Prophets of the period, such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, interpreted the fall as divine judgment while maintaining hope for restoration. Their writings reinforced Jerusalem as a symbolic heart of the Jewish people, a city whose fate was inseparable from their spiritual and national identity. The aftermath of 586 BC also laid the groundwork for the city's eventual resurgence under the Persians. While Jerusalem lay in ruins, its memory persisted in the collective consciousness. Stories of the temple, the kings, and the prophetic voices created a cultural continuity that bridged exile and eventual return. Archaeological surveys of the city of David reveal layers of destruction and subsequent rebuilding, demonstrating that even after conquest, Jerusalem remained inhabited and maintained its significance in regional geopolitics. During this period, the city was also a site of economic and cultural exchange. Trade routes connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant passed nearby, bringing merchants, ideas, and technologies. The elite and priestly classes managed these interactions, while ordinary citizens contributed through labor, crafts, and agriculture. Even amid political collapse, the city retained an essential function as a regional node, linking people, ideas, and faith across centuries. The period from 1000 to 586 BCE, therefore, is not merely the story of kings and temples. It is a story of urban evolution, faith, resilience, and vulnerability. Jerusalem's rise from a fortified hilltop town to the capital of a kingdom and the site of the first temple established enduring patterns, the fusion of political authority with religious centrality, the negotiation between local autonomy and imperial pressures, and the constant tension between destruction and reconstruction. These themes would echo through every subsequent era of the city's history. By the close of this era, Jerusalem had already earned a reputation that would outlast empires. It was a city of faith and politics, of walls and temples, of memory and aspiration. The events of the Assyrian siege, the Siloam Tunnel, the construction of the First Temple, and the Babylonian exile set the stage for centuries of cultural, religious, and political significance. From a small Canaanite town, Jerusalem had become a symbol, the heart of a people, the center of a religion, and a city whose story would reverberate through millennia. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE marked a seismic shift in the ancient Near East. The mighty city that had destroyed Jerusalem and exiled its people now fell to a new power, Cyrus the Great of Persia. With a stroke of imperial policy that would echo through history, Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their ancestral homeland. For the first time in 70 years, Jerusalem would see the return of its people, its priests, and its traditions. The exile, though a period of profound suffering and reflection, had forged a renewed sense of identity among the Jewish people, who now carried a collective memory of a destroyed city and a lost temple. By 516 BCE, the Second Temple stood atop the Temple Mount, smaller than Solomon's original structure, but imbued with immense symbolic power. The completion of this temple represented more than religious reconstruction. It signaled a cultural and political rebirth. Jerusalem was no longer a city of exile, but a center for worship, governance, and communal life under Persian oversight. Archaeological evidence from this period, including foundations, pottery, and ritual implements, paints a picture of a modest yet organized urban settlement. Streets were narrow and winding, reflecting the topography, while administrative buildings and storage facilities supported the temple and the priestly class that managed its functions. Under Persian rule, Jerusalem became a provincial town governed by local Jewish authorities, but ultimately accountable to the distant Persian satrap. This arrangement allowed for a degree of autonomy that was essential for rebuilding religious institutions and restoring civic life. The city's population likely numbered in the tens of thousands, a mix of returning exiles, local populations who had remained during the Babylonian occupation, and settlers from surrounding regions. Life revolved around religious observances, agricultural cycles, and the administration of the temple's offerings. It was a city quietly regaining its footing, one prayer, one harvest, and one rebuilding project at a time. The Hellenistic period began in 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great swept through the Levant in his campaign to conquer the Persian Empire. Jerusalem, strategically located on a ridge overlooking the approaches to the Jordan Valley and the coastal plains, came under his influence. Alexander's conquest introduced the city to Greek culture, language, and political structures. Following his death in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented, and Jerusalem found itself caught between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria, two Hellenistic dynasties vying for control of the Levant. This era of shifting allegiances brought both challenges and opportunities for Jerusalem. The city had to navigate diplomacy carefully, aligning with the power that best allowed its autonomy while avoiding the fate of towns that resisted. Religious life during the Hellenistic period became a point of contention and transformation. Greek culture emphasized public rituals, civic festivals, and architecture, which clashed with Jewish traditions centered on the temple and its laws. In 167 BCE, this tension reached a breaking point under the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who attempted to impose Hellenistic religious practices in the temple, even dedicating it to Zeus. This act of desecration ignited outrage across Judea and sparked the Maccabean Revolt, a revolt led by Judas Maccabeus and his family. The rebellion was not merely military. It was a cultural and religious struggle to preserve Jewish identity against the pressures of imperial assimilation. The Maccabees' success culminated in the recapture and purification of the temple, an event celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah to this day. By the end of the revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty was established, and Jerusalem once again became the capital of an independent Jewish kingdom. For nearly a century, the city thrived politically, culturally, and religiously. The Hasmoneans expanded Jerusalem's walls, fortified key approaches, and strengthened the temple as the symbolic and practical heart of the city. Archaeological evidence from this period, including coinage, inscriptions, and building projects, reflects a Jerusalem that was vibrant, resilient, and aware of its enduring significance. Economically, the city benefited from its position as a trade hub. Goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean passed through the region, while local agriculture supplied food for residents and pilgrims alike. Olive oil, wine, and grain became staples of the local economy, and workshops produced pottery, tools, and ritual objects. The revival of Jerusalem during the Persian and Hellenistic periods was not just spiritual. It was practical, commercial, and civic, laying foundations for the city's later prominence under Roman rule. The architecture and urban layout of Jerusalem during this era reflected a synthesis of influences. Persian policies encouraged reconstruction and administrative order, while Hellenistic styles introduced new forms of public space, fortification techniques, and urban planning concepts. Streets were likely organized around key gates and the temple precinct, creating a functional yet symbolically charged environment. The Temple Mount remained the city's spiritual center, but the surrounding cityscape began to evolve to accommodate trade, governance, and defense. Socially, Jerusalem was a city of contrasts. Priests and scholars oversaw religious life, maintaining the laws and rituals codified during the exile. Artisans, farmers, and merchants worked to sustain the urban population. At the same time, the city had to negotiate the presence of foreign powers, shifting loyalties, and the challenges of rebuilding a society after exile and destruction. These dynamics created a city deeply aware of its historical vulnerability, yet confident in its emerging identity. By the end of this period, around 167 BCE, Jerusalem had survived conquest, exile, and foreign domination. It had been rebuilt physically and spiritually, fortified culturally and politically, and had emerged as a symbol of resilience and identity. The Maccabean Revolt, the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, and the purification of the temple set a precedent. Jerusalem would not merely survive, it would assert its significance across centuries and empires. This era illustrates how Jerusalem, though small in population, was monumental in influence. Its story during the Persian and Hellenistic periods demonstrates that cities are more than walls and stone. They are expressions of faith, identity, and the human desire to endure. The foundations laid in these centuries, the Second Temple, fortified walls, civic structures, and religious traditions, would endure through the upheavals of the Roman period and beyond, shaping Jerusalem's enduring legacy as a city at the heart of history, faith, and culture. The Maccabean Revolt, sparked in 167 BCE by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes' desecration of the Second Temple, marked a decisive turning point in Jerusalem's history. This revolt was more than a military campaign. It was a profound assertion of identity, faith, and self-determination. Under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus and his family, the Jewish rebels waged a guerrilla war across Judea, reclaiming cities, fortresses, and sacred spaces. By 164 BCE, Jerusalem was liberated, the temple purified, and a festival of rededication, Hanukkah, established to commemorate this moment. For the first time in centuries, Jerusalem became the capital of an independent Jewish kingdom ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmoneans were both priests and kings, a dual authority that reinforced Jerusalem's unique intertwining of religious and political power. They expanded the city's territory, extending fortifications to protect against neighboring powers and internal dissent. Archaeological layers from this period reveal complex walls, towers, and gates, tangible signs of a city asserting its independence. Yet their rule was not without challenges. Internal strife, family rivalries, and debates over religious observance characterized much of Hasmonean governance. Jerusalem, while sovereign, remained vulnerable to the ambitions of larger empires on its borders. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had emerged as the dominant force in the Mediterranean. The Hasmonean kingdom, though independent, found itself caught between the competing interests of Rome and Parthia, the Eastern Empire. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, ostensibly to mediate a dynastic dispute. The city surrendered, and while its walls and temple were largely spared, Roman influence became inescapable. From this moment on, Jerusalem's rulers had to navigate the delicate balance of autonomy under imperial oversight, a tension that would define its next century. Rome soon appointed Herod the Great as king of Judea in 37 BCE. a ruler whose ambition and architectural vision would leave an indelible mark on the city. Herod undertook grand construction projects, the most notable being the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Between 20 BCE and 10 BCE, the temple was transformed into one of the most magnificent religious complexes in the ancient world. Massive retaining walls were erected, expanding the Temple Mount platform and creating courtyards, colonnades, and ceremonial spaces capable of accommodating thousands of worshippers. Herod's Jerusalem was a city of stone and awe, a display of Roman engineering blended with Jewish religious centrality. Herod's renovations extended beyond the temple. The city's fortifications were strengthened, palaces constructed, and aqueducts built to supply water to an expanding population. Jerusalem became a city that reflected the cosmopolitan grandeur of Rome, yet retained its religious core. Pilgrims traveled from across the Levant to witness the splendor of the temple, participate in festivals, and engage in trade. The city's population likely swelled during these events, creating a dynamic urban environment where commerce, worship, and politics intersected. Yet beneath this facade of grandeur, Jerusalem simmered with tension. Roman taxation, political interference, and the presence of foreign officials bred resentment. Religious groups debated the proper interpretation of law. Social divisions widened between elites and commoners. The Jewish populace, proud of their history and temple, chafed under Roman oversight. These pressures set the stage for the first major revolt against Roman authority in the city's history. In 66 CE, after years of accumulating grievances, the Jewish population of Jerusalem and the surrounding regions erupted in revolt. Known as the Great Jewish Revolt, it was both a nationalist and religious uprising, seeking to reclaim control over the temple, the city, and the broader land of Judea. The revolt escalated into a brutal conflict. Roman legions, commanded by generals who would later become emperors, laid siege to the city, cutting off supplies, breaching walls, and systematically destroying neighborhoods. Jerusalem's topography, its hills, valleys, and fortifications initially offered defenders advantages, but Rome's engineering prowess and military discipline proved overwhelming. The climax came in 70 CE, when the Roman general Titus captured the city after months of siege. Contemporary accounts, including the historian Josephus, describe a city ravaged by famine, fire, and slaughter. The Second Temple was destroyed, its sacred stones thrown down or burned, the rituals and sacrifices that had defined Jerusalem's religious life for generations brought to an abrupt end. The city's walls were breached, homes burned, and the urban infrastructure reduced to rubble. Only one section of the retaining wall survived, what we now call the Western Wall, a silent witness to the city's enduring significance and the tragedy of its fall. The destruction of 70 CE marked not just a military defeat, but a profound cultural and religious rupture. The loss of the temple disrupted the priesthood, dismantled the sacrificial system, and sent shockwaves through Jewish communities across the Mediterranean. Pilgrimages ceased, festivals could not be observed in their traditional form, and Jerusalem's centrality and Jewish identity shifted from a physical space to a symbolic, spiritual core. Yet, even in devastation, the city's story continued, preserved in memory, scripture, and the diaspora. This era, from the Hasmoneans to the Roman destruction, encapsulates recurring patterns in Jerusalem's history: ambition, resilience, conflict, and reinvention. The city was a crucible in which faith and politics were inseparable. It experienced the heights of autonomy under the Hasmoneans, the transformative grandeur of Herod's projects, and the depths of devastation under Rome. Each phase left a tangible mark on the city's landscape, its people, and its enduring narrative. By the end of 70 CE, Jerusalem lay in ruins, yet the memory of its walls, its temple, and its centrality in Jewish faith persisted. The city had experienced conquest, reconstruction, and rebellion, each layer adding complexity to its identity. The events of this period foreshadowed centuries of struggle, exile, and return, while demonstrating the enduring power of Jerusalem as a symbol of a city whose walls, stones, and stories would continue to resonate long after the ashes had cooled. The year 70 CE marked the culmination of centuries of political, religious, and social tension in Jerusalem. After the Great Jewish Revolt, Roman forces under Titus captured the city, laying waste to its streets, walls, and sacred temple. The destruction was near total. Homes burned, defenses razed, and the Second Temple, the heart of Jewish religious life for centuries, reduced to rubble. Pilgrims who had once thronged its courts now found nothing but scorched stone. Survivors faced famine, disease, and forced enslavement. Jerusalem, once the thriving capital of a kingdom and the spiritual center of a people, had been transformed into a symbol of catastrophe and exile. Yet the story of Jerusalem did not end in ashes. The Jewish people, dispersed across the Roman Empire and beyond, carried the city in their memory, prayers, and traditions. The fall of 70 CE crystallized the city's role as a spiritual and national symbol. Its destruction was mourned annually, and the Hebrew calendar continued to mark the temple's fall as a period of fasting and reflection. The memory of the city became a thread connecting the scattered diaspora, a unifying emblem of faith, identity, and longing. For decades, Jerusalem remained a shadow of its former self, a city partially abandoned and largely overlooked by Rome. Yet in 132 CE, a spark reignited hope and resistance. Known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, this uprising was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic leader who proclaimed himself the Messiah and sought to reclaim Judea and Jerusalem for the Jewish people. The revolt was fueled by religious zeal, nationalistic aspirations, and resentment toward Roman occupation. For 3 years, Jewish rebels achieved remarkable military successes, even establishing temporary self-governance in parts of Judea. Jerusalem, though heavily fortified and scarred from previous destruction, became a rallying point for the resistance. The revolt, however, ultimately provoked a brutal response from Rome. Emperor Hadrian, determined to quash the uprising and prevent further insurrections, deployed legions that devastated the region with calculated severity. By 135 CE, the rebellion was crushed. Bar Kokhba was killed, and Roman forces systematically destroyed towns, fortifications, and farmlands across Judea. Jerusalem itself was leveled. Archaeological evidence from this period shows widespread destruction: collapsed walls, burned layers of habitation, and abandoned streets, signaling both the immediate violence of the conquest and the long-term decline of urban life. In place of Jerusalem's ruins, Hadrian established a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina. This new city was designed to assert Roman authority, erase the memory of Jewish sovereignty, and integrate the region into the imperial system. A temple to Jupiter was erected on the site of the former Jewish temple, symbolically replacing the sacred space of Yahweh with Roman paganism. Streets were reorganized along the Roman grid, forums and public spaces introduced, and Roman architectural styles imposed on the landscape. By reconstructing the city in a Roman image, Hadrian sought not merely to rebuild, but to rewrite the narrative of Jerusalem, converting a center of Jewish identity into a symbol of imperial dominance. Jews were banned from the city, permitted to enter only once a year to mourn at its gates. This edict forced the population to adapt, scattering across the Mediterranean, Babylon, and Egypt, creating a diaspora that would preserve Jewish culture, religion, and identity far from their ancestral home. Synagogues proliferated outside Judea, and texts such as the Mishnah began to codify laws, traditions, and rituals, preserving what had been centered in the destroyed temple. The city's memory endured in exile, prayer, and pilgrimage, a spiritual heart whose physical manifestation had been obliterated. Aelia Capitolina, though Roman in construction and administration, could not erase the sacred memory of Jerusalem. Pilgrims and visitors continued to recognize its historic significance, and over time, Christians began to identify it as the site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, giving the city a new religious dimension. Thus, Jerusalem remained central in global consciousness, even as its streets were patrolled by Roman soldiers and its sacred spaces repurposed. This period illustrates the recurring cycle of destruction and rebirth that would define Jerusalem for millennia. Cities rise and fall, yet certain places hold significance beyond walls and stones. Jerusalem's power lay not merely in its physical structures, but in its meaning to people, to faith, and to history. The ashes of 70 CE and the ruins of 135 CE were as much a crucible of identity as they were a testament to Roman might. From devastation emerged resilience, from exile emerged cultural preservation, and from suppression emerged new religious expressions. Economically and socially, the destruction reshaped the region. Agricultural lands were burned or abandoned, trade networks disrupted, and the urban elite displaced. The Roman imposition of Aelia Capitolina signaled the beginning of a city organized to serve imperial interests rather than the needs of a local Jewish population. Military presence was heavy. Legions stationed nearby enforced order, while Roman colonists introduced new governance systems. Despite this, the memory of Jerusalem as the heart of Jewish life persisted, creating a tension between imperial authority and cultural identity that would echo through future centuries. Religiously, the era catalyzed transformation in practice and belief. The destruction of the temple forced Judaism to adapt. Rituals once centered on sacrifice and the priesthood shifted toward study, prayer, and communal observance. Rabbinic Judaism began to take shape, emphasizing law, ethics, and textual interpretation as means to preserve identity in the absence of a centralized temple. These developments were born out of tragedy, yet they ensured that Jerusalem's spiritual centrality endured, even when physical access was denied. By the end of this period, Jerusalem's identity as a symbol of longing, faith, and resilience was firmly established. Though the city lay in ruins, its narrative of destruction and defiance, exile and hope had become central to Jewish consciousness. The lessons of 70 and 135 CE would resonate through subsequent empires, religious movements, and political struggles, ensuring that Jerusalem remained not merely a city, but a cultural and spiritual anchor for a dispersed people. Thus, from fire and ashes, Jerusalem's enduring legacy was forged. It was no longer solely a city of stone and walls, but a living idea, the embodiment of struggle, devotion, and memory. Its physical destruction in this period only magnified its symbolic and spiritual significance, preparing it for the complex layers of history yet to come. By the early 4th century CE, Jerusalem had undergone centuries of conquest, destruction, and rebuilding, yet it remained a city of profound symbolic significance. Its identity, long anchored in Jewish tradition, began to shift dramatically with the rise of Christianity. The pivotal moment came in 313 CE, when Emperor Constantine the Great issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the Roman Empire. For Jerusalem, this decree heralded a new era. The city was poised to become the spiritual capital of a faith that would soon dominate the Mediterranean world. Shortly thereafter, Constantine's mother, Helena, undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Helena's mission was both devotional and archaeological. She sought to identify the sites associated with the life, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. According to historical accounts, she identified Golgotha, the hill where Jesus had been crucified, and the tomb where he was buried. Helena's journey and findings were momentous. transforming Jerusalem from a provincial Roman city into a magnet for Christian pilgrimage. Her influence also prompted the emperor to commission the construction of monumental Christian structures, embedding the faith into the urban fabric. The most consequential of these constructions was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, dedicated in 335 CE. Built on the site identified as both Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus, it quickly became the spiritual heart of Christian Jerusalem. Pilgrims traveled from across the empire to witness the sacred spaces, venerating the sites of crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. The church itself was architecturally ambitious. Rotundas, basilicas, and elaborate colonnades transformed Jerusalem's skyline, creating a cityscape that proclaimed the ascendancy of Christianity. The urban design, religious rituals, and influx of pilgrims ensured that Jerusalem's significance extended far beyond its modest population. During the Byzantine period, Jerusalem thrived as a religious and cultural hub. Monasteries dotted the surrounding hills, hermits and scholars engaged in theological study, and Christian communities grew both within and beyond the city walls. Byzantine administration, while focused primarily on imperial governance, facilitated the protection and promotion of Christian sites. Roads were repaired, fortifications maintained, and the city became a focal point for the exchange of ideas, religious texts, and pilgrims. Estimates suggest the population ranged from tens of thousands, swelling during major festivals as pilgrims arrived from across the empire. Despite its prosperity, Byzantine Jerusalem remained politically vulnerable. In 614 CE, the city was invaded by Sasanian Persian forces under King Khosrow II. The Persians captured Jerusalem swiftly, taking advantage of the empire's overstretched borders and Byzantine internal divisions. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction and massacre. Churches and homes were burned, and a significant portion of the population was killed or deported to Persia. The loss of religious treasures, including the revered True Cross, was a profound blow to Byzantine prestige and to Christian communities across the empire. The Byzantine response, led by Emperor Heraclius, culminated in the restoration of Jerusalem in 629 CE. Heraclius retook the city, recovered the True Cross, and embarked on a program of rebuilding and religious renewal. Churches were restored, monastic life revived, and pilgrims returned, reaffirming Jerusalem's centrality in Christian devotion. The period of Sasanian occupation, though brief, left deep scars on the urban fabric and the collective memory of the city. It also highlighted the fragility of imperial power and the constant threat posed by competing empires in the region. Throughout the Byzantine period, Jerusalem's urban and architectural character evolved. Streets were paved, forums maintained, and monumental churches constructed alongside older Roman buildings. Water systems, including aqueducts and cisterns, were repaired to sustain a growing population and an influx of pilgrims. The city's walls, initially constructed in earlier eras, were reinforced to withstand external threats, reflecting a constant negotiation between spiritual centrality and military necessity. Culturally, Jerusalem under the Byzantines was a melting pot of traditions and influences. Greek became the dominant language of administration and scholarship, yet local Semitic languages persisted among the population. Religious discourse flourished. Monasteries produced theological texts, hagiographies chronicled the lives of saints, and debates over doctrine shaped Christian thought. Pilgrimage routes connected Jerusalem to Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, making it a nexus not just of devotion, but of intellectual and cultural exchange. The city's population was diverse. Christians were dominant, but Jews and Samaritans remained in smaller communities, often subject to restrictions and intermittent persecution. Pilgrims, merchants, and clerics created a dynamic urban environment where faith, economy, and governance intersected. Markets, thrived near holy sites, while artisans produced religious objects for both local use and pilgrims. Jerusalem's spiritual magnetism was mirrored in its economic and social vitality, even as the city remained modest in size compared to great Mediterranean capitals. By the end of the Byzantine era, Jerusalem had been transformed from a city of exile and destruction into a center of global Christian devotion. Its importance was no longer solely tied to local governance or regional politics. It was now a city whose significance radiated across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the monastic networks, and the memory of martyrdom and miracles made it a pilgrimage destination that would shape religious identity for centuries. Yet, this period also set the stage for future upheaval. Jerusalem's prominence attracted both admiration and envy. Its wealth, sacred status, and strategic location made it a target for emerging powers, a reality that would become starkly evident with the arrival of the early Islamic caliphates in the 7th century. Despite centuries of Byzantine stability and religious flourishing, Jerusalem's fate remained tied to the broader currents of empire, conquest, and faith. In sum, the Byzantine period, 313 to 638 CE, represents a rebuilding and redefinition of Jerusalem. From Constantine's legalization of Christianity to Heraclius's restoration, the city became the heart of a new religious empire, drawing pilgrims, scholars, and artisans alike. Its population, urban infrastructure, and spiritual significance grew in tandem, creating a city that was both modest in size and monumental in influence. Jerusalem's identity, forged over centuries of Jewish sovereignty and Roman conquest, was now layered with Christian meaning, establishing a foundation that would endure even through the seismic shifts of subsequent Islamic rule. In 638 CE, Jerusalem faced another turning point in its turbulent history. The armies of the Rashidun Caliphate, led by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, arrived at the city's gates. Unlike the conquests of earlier empires, Jerusalem surrendered peacefully, recognizing both the strategic realities and the growing power of Islam. Umar entered the city with a combination of military authority and religious respect, establishing protections for the existing Christian population and securing a framework for coexistence. His visit to the Temple Mount, the site of the destroyed Jewish temples, was symbolic. Here, early Muslims began to envision a sacred space that would anchor their emerging religious identity. Under Umar, Jerusalem was integrated into the broader Islamic administration. Taxes were levied on non-Muslim residents through the jizya, while Christians and Jews were granted autonomy in their religious practices. This system allowed Jerusalem to maintain a degree of continuity for its diverse population even as the city transitioned into an Islamic polity. The population was modest by medieval standards, but the city became a critical node in the network of Islamic governance, serving as both a religious and administrative center in the region. By 691 CE, under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, Jerusalem underwent a transformation that would define its spiritual landscape for centuries. The Dome of the Rock was constructed on the foundation stone atop the Temple Mount. This dazzling shrine, adorned with gold and intricate mosaics, was not merely an architectural marvel. It was a statement of religious and political legitimacy. For Muslims, the rock was believed to be the point from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the Isra and Mi'raj, making it the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. Soon after, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built nearby, creating the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Together, these monuments transformed Jerusalem into a focal point of Islamic devotion and pilgrimage. The Haram al-Sharif became more than a religious site. It symbolized the synthesis of political power and spiritual authority. It reflected a city reimagined under Islamic sovereignty, yet layered atop centuries of Jewish and Christian history. Throughout the early Islamic period, Jerusalem remained a cosmopolitan city. Christians continued to inhabit churches and monasteries, while Jews, though fewer in number than in previous centuries, maintained a presence and religious practice. Markets, workshops, and public baths flourished, and the city became a hub for commerce and scholarship. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Latin as the dominant language of administration, culture, and literature, embedding Islamic identity into the city's daily life. The governance of Jerusalem shifted with the succession of Islamic dynasties. The Umayyads initiated monumental building projects, while the Abbasids, who came to power in 750 CE, emphasized administration and trade, integrating Jerusalem into the broader Islamic economy. The Fatimids of Egypt, who controlled the city from the 10th century, oversaw periods of prosperity and decline, building infrastructure while contending with internal unrest and external threats. Despite the changes in rulers, Jerusalem's spiritual significance remained constant, attracting pilgrims from across the Islamic world and beyond. Religiously, Jerusalem became a model of coexistence, albeit under Islamic supremacy. Christian pilgrimage thrived, with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre maintained under dhimmi protection. Jewish communities, while limited in political influence, continued to live in the city, study their texts, and participate in the urban economy. This period demonstrates the adaptability of Jerusalem's population, who navigated the complexities of faith, law, and imperial authority while maintaining the city's historic role as a religious crossroads. The architecture of this era reflected both continuity and innovation. While Roman and Byzantine foundations persisted in street layouts and building cores, Islamic structures introduced new forms, including minarets, mihrabs, and domed shrines. The Dome of the Rock, in particular, combined Roman engineering techniques, Byzantine mosaic artistry, and Islamic religious symbolism, creating a landmark that conveyed both divine significance and political authority. Streets were organized to facilitate processions, markets, and pilgrimages, and fortifications were strengthened to protect against internal revolts and external threats. By the late 11th century, Jerusalem had become a well-established, thriving city under Islamic rule, yet it remained vulnerable to the ambitions of foreign powers. Its religious significance had only grown, making it a prize in the eyes of both European and regional forces. Pilgrimage, commerce, and scholarship flourished, but the city's prosperity also drew the attention of crusading armies seeking to assert control over the Holy Land. In the century between Umar's peaceful entry and the dawn of the Crusades, Jerusalem had undergone a profound transformation. It was no longer primarily a Jewish or Christian city, but a center of Islamic devotion and administration, layered atop its Jewish and Christian past. The Haram al-Sharif, markets, schools, and residential quarters reflected a city that was both alive and historically conscious, a place where faith, politics, and daily life intersected continuously. The early Islamic period also demonstrated the resilience of Jerusalem's symbolic power. Despite centuries of conquest, destruction, and rebuilding, the city retained its central role in religious imagination and imperial ambition. From the Temple Mount to the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem became a city where memory, architecture, and faith converged, setting a template for the centuries of rule and conflict that would follow. Thus, between 638 and 1099 CE, Jerusalem evolved into a city of sacred significance, cultural plurality, and political importance. Its streets and monuments bore witness to the ambitions of empires, the devotion of pilgrims, and the resilience of communities that adapted to new rulers while maintaining links to their past. By the time the Crusaders arrived in 1099, Jerusalem had already been shaped into a complex, multi-layered urban landscape, one in which faith, power, and memory were inseparable, and where the stage was set for another dramatic chapter in its enduring story. In 1099 CE, after months of grueling campaigns across Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, the armies of the First Crusade reached Jerusalem. For nearly a century, the city had thrived under early Islamic rule, its streets alive with merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and worshippers of multiple faiths. Yet its spiritual significance as the site of the crucifixion, resurrection, and burial of Jesus drew Western European knights driven by religious zeal, promises of salvation, and the lure of earthly power. Jerusalem, the city of memory and faith, was about to experience one of its most violent chapters. The siege of Jerusalem was relentless. Crusader forces, numbering perhaps tens of thousands, encircled the city, cutting off supplies and systematically attacking its walls. Jerusalem's fortifications, strengthened under Fatimid rule, held initially, but the attackers were determined. Contemporary chroniclers describe months of starvation and suffering among the city's inhabitants, as well as brutal assaults that breached the gates. When the Crusaders finally stormed the city in July 1099, what followed was a massacre of unprecedented scale. Jewish residents, Muslims, and even some local Christians were slaughtered in the streets. Bodies reportedly piled in the city's marketplaces and along its roads, an atrocity that echoed through history. The Crusaders sought not merely military victory, but the total conquest of the city, asserting dominion through terror as much as through force. Once in control, the Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, with Godfrey of Bouillon named its first ruler, though he refused the title of king, choosing instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusaders transformed Jerusalem into a capital of both religious and political significance, imposing Latin Christian structures atop a city that had been shaped by centuries of Islamic and Byzantine influence. Churches were repaired and converted, new fortifications erected, and administrative systems introduced to govern the diverse population, which now included displaced Muslims, surviving Jews, and incoming European settlers. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre regained prominence under Crusader administration. Pilgrimage continued, but the city's Christian identity was now tightly intertwined with European political control. Monks, knights, and clerics established residences and offices within Jerusalem, while the city became a hub for Western influence in the Levant. Pilgrimage routes extended further into Crusader-held territories, connecting Jerusalem to Antioch, Tripoli, and Acre. Markets flourished, supplying pilgrims and settlers alike with goods ranging from textiles to spices. Despite the violence of the conquest, the Crusaders sought to create a city that could sustain long-term settlement and serve as the heart of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land. Yet the city's new rulers faced constant challenges. The surrounding countryside remained hostile, with local Muslim rulers seeking to reclaim territory. Internal tensions among Crusaders between knights, clergy, and settlers often complicated governance. Jerusalem's population was small relative to its fame, yet the city's spiritual significance amplified its strategic importance. Control of Jerusalem was not merely about territory. It was about prestige, religious authority, and the symbolic heart of Christendom. For nearly 90 years, the Latin Kingdom maintained a fragile dominance over Jerusalem. During this time, the Crusaders fortified the city further, adding walls, towers, and gates to secure it against both internal revolt and external assault. They established legal and military institutions, integrated with the feudal structures familiar to European settlers, and attempted to enforce Christian religious practices, sometimes at the expense of local traditions and populations. The coexistence that had characterized earlier Islamic Jerusalem was largely supplanted by European dominance, yet the city retained its complex, multi-layered identity. The balance of power shifted dramatically in 1187 CE, when Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, defeated the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin. This decisive victory opened the path for the recapture of Jerusalem. Saladin approached the city with both military skill and political calculation. Unlike the Crusaders in 1099, he sought to avoid a wholesale massacre, understanding the strategic and symbolic importance of humane treatment. When Jerusalem surrendered in October 1187, Christian inhabitants were allowed to leave safely, and the city returned to Islamic control under Ayyubid administration. Saladin's reconquest marked a turning point in Jerusalem's history. The city was restored to Muslim rule, yet its sacred significance for Christians was acknowledged through protections for churches and pilgrims. Saladin's actions demonstrated a nuanced approach to governance in a city layered with religious meaning. Markets reopened, mosques were maintained, and the Haram al-Sharif continued to be a focal point of devotion. Jerusalem, once again, became a city where faith, politics, and diplomacy intersected. This period illustrates several recurring themes in Jerusalem's history: conquest, symbolic importance, religious centrality, and the fragility of human rule. The Crusader conquest was not merely an isolated military campaign. It was an assertion of the city's spiritual significance in a new global religious context. Likewise, Saladin's recapture reflected the same dynamics, highlighting Jerusalem's enduring power to inspire devotion, ambition, and conflict. The Crusader period also left a lasting architectural and cultural legacy. Fortifications, churches, and administrative buildings introduced European styles to the city, adding another layer to its complex urban fabric. Pilgrimage routes, trade networks, and monastic communities reflected a city deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean and European worlds. Despite the violence, Jerusalem continued to function as a center of human activity, where commerce, faith, and governance intertwined. By the end of the 12th century, Jerusalem had been transformed yet again. From Islamic city to Crusader capital and back, it had demonstrated a remarkable resilience, adapting to the ambitions of conquerors while preserving its spiritual significance. The events of 1099 to 1187 CE underscore a critical lesson in the city's long history. Jerusalem's meaning extends beyond walls and rulers, encompassing faith, memory, and identity in ways that persist even through cycles of conquest and violence. In essence, the Crusader era left Jerusalem as a city of memory and myth, scarred by blood yet luminous with spiritual resonance. It was a city whose stones bore witness to human ambition, devotion, and suffering, a city poised on the cusp of further transformations that would continue through the centuries, from Ayyubid to Mamluk, Ottoman, and into the modern era. After Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, the city entered a period of relative stability under the Ayyubid dynasty, yet its fate remained tethered to the shifting currents of Middle Eastern politics. Saladin's triumph restored Islamic authority and ended nearly 9 decades of Crusader rule. But the city's population had been severely diminished by prior massacres, sieges, and the general turbulence of warfare. Jerusalem, once a bustling center of trade and pilgrimage, now faced the challenge of rebuilding its social, religious, and urban infrastructure in a world dominated by powerful regional empires. The Ayyubids, Saladin's successors, sought to revitalize Jerusalem while maintaining a careful balance of religious tolerance. Muslims were re-established as the dominant demographic, but Christian pilgrimage was permitted, and Christian institutions were generally allowed to operate under dhimmi protections. Jews, who had suffered under the Crusader occupation, gradually returned in limited numbers, reconstituting small communities. The city's population remained modest, likely in the tens of thousands, but it regained a level of civic and religious life that allowed it to function as a spiritual hub. Architecturally and urbanistically, the Ayyubids made selective enhancements to Jerusalem's defenses and infrastructure. Fortifications were repaired, walls reinforced, and city gates strengthened, reflecting both practical military concerns and the symbolic need to assert control over a city of immense religious importance. Schools, mosques, and charitable institutions were funded by the Ayyubid rulers, demonstrating the dynasty's commitment to the city's spiritual and cultural vitality. Roads and markets facilitated the movement of pilgrims and goods, linking Jerusalem to broader networks of commerce across Egypt, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula. Despite these efforts, the Ayyubid period was marked by political fragmentation. Jerusalem often shifted between the hands of various Ayyubid princes, each ruling with varying degrees of autonomy and administrative competence. External pressures, particularly from rival Muslim rulers, Crusader enclaves along the coast, and the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, created an environment of intermittent instability. The city's limited strategic value meant that it was often spared the most devastating military campaigns, yet its spiritual significance ensured it remained a target of intrigue, diplomacy, and occasional conflict. By the mid-13th century, the Mamluks emerged as the dominant power in Egypt and Syria. These former slave soldiers seized control of Jerusalem in 1250 CE and ushered in a period of religious, architectural, and cultural investment that would shape the city for centuries. Under Mamluk rule, Jerusalem became primarily a center of pilgrimage rather than a political capital. Mosques were expanded, madrasas, religious schools, constructed, and conquests, Sufi lodges, established. The Mamluks also maintained public amenities, such as markets, baths, and fountains, ensuring the city's urban life remained vibrant despite its modest size. One of the most significant Mamluk contributions was the restoration and embellishment of the Haram al-Sharif, including the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Decorative tiles, calligraphy, and architectural enhancements reinforced the city's religious prestige, signaling both piety and authority. The Mamluks also repaired and reinforced the city walls, a project that preserved much of Jerusalem's medieval fortifications into the modern era. These efforts transformed Jerusalem into a city whose spiritual prominence outstripped its political or economic importance, making it a religious capital without an empire. During this period, Jerusalem's population remained diverse but fragile. Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted under a structured system of dhimmi protections, yet they were subject to taxation, restrictions, and the occasional outbreak of violence. Pilgrimage continued to drive the city's economy, with seasonal influxes of visitors sustaining markets, artisans, and religious institutions. Trade networks connected Jerusalem to Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and beyond, but the city's economic base was narrow, heavily reliant on its religious significance rather than agricultural or industrial production. Jerusalem's decline in political and strategic importance was offset by its growing role as a spiritual and cultural symbol. Sufi orders, scholars, and travelers chronicled the city's sacred sites, reinforcing its reputation as a center of devotion. The memory of past empires, Crusader conquests, and biblical associations contributed to a layered identity that was simultaneously Islamic, Jewish, and Christian. Jerusalem had become a city defined more by faith and memory than by temporal power, a characteristic that would persist through Ottoman and modern times. The late Middle Ages saw Jerusalem increasingly viewed as a provincial town, albeit a holy one. Its rulers focused on maintaining stability, preserving religious monuments, and facilitating pilgrimage rather than pursuing territorial conquest or political expansion. This period of relative calm, however, did not shield the city from the broader geopolitical upheavals of the region, including the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols, regional rebellions, and intermittent Crusader attempts to reclaim influence along the Levantine coast. Culturally, Jerusalem under the Mamluks retained a rich intellectual life. Scholars produced works on Islamic law, theology, and history, while artisans continued traditions in calligraphy, tilework, and metalwork. Pilgrims and merchants brought ideas, goods, and customs from across the Islamic world, creating a cosmopolitan environment that reflected Jerusalem's ongoing significance as a nexus of faith and learning. Yet despite these achievements, the city remained economically and politically dependent on the patronage of its rulers, unable to develop the autonomy or wealth seen in other regional centers. By the eve of the Ottoman conquest in 1517, Jerusalem had solidified its identity as a spiritual center rather than a political capital. Its walls enclosed a modest urban core, punctuated by mosques, churches, and synagogues. Pilgrims continued to arrive, maintaining the city's economy and cultural relevance. Though its population was small and its influence limited, Jerusalem's religious magnetism ensured that it remained at the center of regional consciousness. Its history of conquest, exile, and coexistence had forged a city resilient in identity, layered in memory, and deeply symbolic to multiple faiths. In summary, the period from 1187 to 1517 CE illustrates a Jerusalem that thrived spiritually while declining politically. From Saladin's reconquest through Ayyubid administration to Mamluk patronage, the city was defined less by empires than by devotion, pilgrimage, and architectural legacy. Its streets, monuments, and markets reflected centuries of human ingenuity and religious fervor, even as political power ebbed and flowed elsewhere. Jerusalem had become a city whose meaning was eternal, its importance measured not in armies or kings, but in faith, memory, and the enduring power of sacred space. In 1517 CE, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim I swept through the Levant, defeating the Mamluks and absorbing Jerusalem into an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Unlike previous conquests that had brought destruction or dramatic administrative shifts, the Ottoman incorporation of Jerusalem marked the beginning of 4 centuries of relative stability, punctuated by intermittent local turbulence but defined by enduring imperial oversight. The Ottomans governed Jerusalem as a provincial city within the larger Syrian islet, emphasizing administrative order, religious patronage, and the symbolic integration of the city into a sprawling Islamic empire. One of the most transformative projects under Ottoman rule came during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1520 to 1566 CE. Between 1537 and 1541, Suleiman undertook the ambitious reconstruction of Jerusalem's ancient city walls. The previous fortifications, dating from the Mamluk period, had deteriorated, leaving the city vulnerable to both natural decay and potential attack. Suleiman's architects, combining Ottoman military engineering with respect for the city's historic layout, rebuilt the walls in stone, encircling the old city in the form recognizable today. The walls, punctuated by imposing gates such as the Jaffa Gate, Damascus Gate, and Lion's Gate, not only served defensive purposes but also marked a symbolic assertion of Ottoman sovereignty over a city central to multiple faiths. Within these walls, the city itself remained modest in size, housing tens of thousands of residents at most. Jerusalem was a provincial capital, important for its spiritual significance rather than its economic or political clout. Life in the old city was dense and compact. Narrow streets wound between religious sites, markets, bathhouses, and residential quarters. Despite its limited physical expansion, Jerusalem remained a hub for pilgrimage, drawing Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the Ottoman realm. Religious festivals, especially the annual Hajj-related gatherings and Christian celebrations like Easter, animated the streets and marketplaces, sustaining both cultural and economic life. The Ottomans maintained a careful balance in Jerusalem between religious diversity and imperial authority. Muslims were the dominant group, and Islamic law governed public life, but Christian and Jewish communities were officially recognized under the millet system. This arrangement allowed each religious group to maintain internal leadership, manage personal and religious affairs, and preserve communal institutions. Churches and synagogues were permitted to function, often repaired or expanded under the patronage of local rulers, European powers, or the Ottoman state itself. This structure created a degree of institutional stability that contrasted with the upheavals of previous centuries. Urban development under the Ottomans was subtle but significant. Public works, including the construction of fountains, cisterns, and caravanserais, improved daily life for residents and travelers alike. Markets expanded to accommodate the steady flow of pilgrims and trade goods. Craftsmen, artisans, and merchants produced textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and religious artifacts, creating a thriving local economy despite the city's provincial status. The old city's neighborhoods became increasingly organized along both religious and occupational lines, reflecting a long-standing tradition of urban partitioning that facilitated social and economic order. Jerusalem's spiritual status was carefully preserved and enhanced. The Haram al-Sharif, encompassing the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, continued to serve as the focal point of Islamic worship. Sufi orders established lodges and schools, maintaining a continuous presence of spiritual scholarship. Simultaneously, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, along with other Christian holy sites, received attention from both the Ottoman administration and European powers, including France, Russia, and the Vatican. Jewish communities, though smaller than Muslim and Christian populations, maintained synagogues, study halls, and pilgrim hostels, ensuring continuity of religious practice. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Jerusalem faced intermittent challenges, including plagues, earthquakes, and occasional local unrest. Yet the city remained largely insulated from major military campaigns, in part due to its position within the Ottoman provincial system and the empire's broader stability. Pilgrimage continued to anchor its economy, while religious institutions acted as centers of education, charity, and social cohesion. The city's population grew slowly, reflecting both natural limitations within the walls and broader regional demographic trends. By the 19th century, Jerusalem began to experience renewed attention from European powers. Britain, France, and Russia invested in archaeological excavations, funded missionary work, and established schools, hospitals, and churches. These projects introduced Western architectural and cultural influences into the city, creating a tension between the old city's medieval character and new external investments. Pilgrimage remained central, but Jerusalem was now increasingly entangled in global religious and political currents, a precursor to the dramatic changes that would arrive with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans also promoted religious diplomacy to manage tensions between competing faiths. Disputes over holy sites were addressed through imperial decrees, and oversight of Christian and Jewish communities was maintained to prevent conflicts from escalating. This delicate balance reflected both the city's sacred nature and the Ottoman imperative to preserve legitimacy across a multi-religious empire. Despite its provincial status, Jerusalem remained a microcosm of empire, where faith, politics, and daily life intersected in complex ways. In sum, the Ottoman period from 1517 to 1917 reshaped Jerusalem in enduring ways. Suleiman's walls physically defined the city, creating the boundaries that persist today. The city's religious infrastructure, markets, and urban organization reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge, combining Mamluk, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions. Jerusalem under Ottoman rule was a city of faith more than of empire, sustained by pilgrimage, religious administration, and a delicate balance of multicultural governance. As the 20th century approached, Jerusalem's position as a spiritual center ensured that it would once again become a focal point for international attention and geopolitical struggle. Yet, even as the empire that had overseen its stability began to wane, the structures, institutions, and cultural memory established during the Ottoman era continued to define the city's character. Suleiman's walls, the thriving religious quarters, and the complex social fabric of the Old City served as a foundation for modern Jerusalem, preserving its sacred heritage while preparing it for the dramatic upheavals of the 20th century. In 1917, as World War I raged across Europe and the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, which had governed Jerusalem for 4 centuries, began to crumble under military defeat and internal decay. The British forces, led by General Edmund Allenby, advanced into Palestine, capturing key towns and cities along the way. On December 9, 1917, Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, a gesture of reverence to the city's sacred status, and effectively ended Ottoman rule. This marked the beginning of a new era, Jerusalem under British administration. The British occupation was formalized with the League of Nations mandate for Palestine in 1922, granting Britain administrative control over the territory while committing it to prepare the region for self-governance. Jerusalem became the administrative center of the mandate, with British civil authorities, police, and infrastructure projects reshaping the city's governance. Modern utilities, electricity, sewage systems, and public services were gradually introduced, and roads, schools, and hospitals expanded the city's footprint. The Jewish community, revitalized by waves of immigration spurred in part by the Balfour Declaration of 1917, grew rapidly. The declaration, which expressed British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, fueled both hope and anxiety. Jewish immigrants established neighborhoods, cultural institutions, and religious schools. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem was founded in 1925, symbolizing a new intellectual and cultural renaissance. Synagogues, communal centers, and kibbutzim strengthened the Jewish presence within the city, weaving modern aspirations into centuries-old spiritual roots. Simultaneously, Arab Jerusalem maintained its traditional character, rooted in Islamic, Christian, and local civic institutions. Mosques, markets, and churches continued to serve as hubs of religious and social life. Arab political movements emerged, organizing opposition to British policies and Jewish immigration. Tensions erupted into violence during the 1920s and 1930s, including riots, demonstrations, and clashes that left hundreds dead or injured. Jerusalem, a city long accustomed to conquest and change, found itself at the epicenter of a new, modern conflict that mirrored global political shifts, nationalist movements, and the trauma of colonial administration. The period also saw the intersection of international interests in Jerusalem. Britain, as the mandatory power, attempted to maintain order, often mediating between Jewish and Arab communities while advancing imperial objectives. France and Russia asserted influence over Christian holy sites, funding restoration and construction projects, while other European powers engaged diplomatically or financially to protect religious and political interests. Jerusalem's historic role as a holy city now intersected with the emerging mechanisms of 20th century geopolitics, transforming it into a stage for diplomacy, propaganda, and global attention. During World War II and the immediate post-war period, Jerusalem became a focal point for Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. Thousands arrived seeking safety, shelter, and a spiritual home. This influx intensified demographic pressures and heightened tensions with the Arab population, who viewed mass immigration as a threat to their historical presence and political aspirations. The British struggled to manage this complex reality, enforcing restrictive immigration policies that often inflamed both communities. The culmination of these tensions arrived with the end of the British Mandate in 1948. As Britain withdrew, the city became a flashpoint in the Arab-Israeli War, which erupted immediately following the declaration of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. Fighting engulfed Jerusalem, with Jewish and Arab forces vying for control of the city's strategic and symbolic locations. By the end of the conflict, a fragile and contentious division of Jerusalem was established: West Jerusalem under Israeli control and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, under Jordanian rule. This division had profound consequences. For the first time in centuries, Jews were barred from the Western Wall, their most sacred site, while Muslims and Christians in East Jerusalem maintained access to the Haram al-Sharif and other holy sites. The city became a symbolic and practical partition, reflecting the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict that would dominate the region for decades. Jordan undertook reconstruction and administration of East Jerusalem, maintaining its religious sites, schools, and infrastructure, while Israel established governance, housing, and services in West Jerusalem. The split city embodied the fractured identities, contested sovereignties, and enduring religious significance that define Jerusalem to this day. Throughout the British Mandate and Jordanian period, Jerusalem's population remained a mosaic of communities. Muslims, Christians, and Jews continued to live in proximity, sharing markets, neighborhoods, and public spaces, yet the underlying tensions and emerging national identities created constant friction. Pilgrimage persisted, although access and safety were sometimes restricted by political circumstances. The city's sacred status ensured that international attention remained intense, with media, diplomats, and religious leaders closely monitoring events in this small but symbolically massive urban space. The period between 1917 and 1967 also highlights the intersection of modernization and tradition. While British infrastructure projects introduced modern utilities and planning concepts, the old city's medieval streets, walls, and religious quarters largely persisted. Schools, hospitals, and administrative buildings brought 20th-century institutions into close contact with centuries-old religious structures. This duality created a Jerusalem that was both ancient and modern, a city where history, faith, and contemporary politics collided daily. By 1967, Jerusalem had emerged from 4 decades of transformative yet turbulent governance under the British and Jordanian administrations. Its streets bore the marks of modernization, war, and demographic shifts, while its sacred sites continued to draw pilgrims from around the world. Yet the unresolved political divisions, demographic tensions, and religious claims set the stage for the next pivotal chapter in Jerusalem's history: the Six-Day War, during which Israel captured East Jerusalem and the city's modern contested identity was solidified. In essence, the period from 1917 to 1967 underscores Jerusalem's dual nature: a city both modern and ancient, contested and revered. British and Jordanian rule introduced new governance structures, infrastructure, and educational initiatives, but they could not resolve the deep-rooted religious, cultural, and nationalist tensions that had accumulated over centuries. Jerusalem remained a city of faith, memory, and symbolism, a place where local life, global politics, and historical legacy intersected in ways that continue to define its identity today. In June 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel launched a lightning campaign against neighboring Arab states Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, reshaping the map of the Middle East. One of the most consequential outcomes of this brief but transformative conflict was the capture of East Jerusalem from Jordanian control, effectively reunifying the city under Israeli administration. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, all of Jerusalem came under a single political authority, yet the city's status, both symbolically and legally, remained deeply contested on the international stage. Israel swiftly moved to consolidate control over the reunited city. Jewish access to the Western Wall, previously restricted under Jordanian rule, was restored, and the old city's Jewish quarter underwent reconstruction after years of neglect and destruction. At the same time, Muslims and Christians continued to worship at their respective holy sites, including the Haram al-Sharif, which remained under a special Islamic custodianship arrangement administered by the Jordanian-appointed Waqf, reflecting the sensitivity of religious governance. Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem in December 1967 was met with widespread international condemnation, as the United Nations and most member states refused to recognize sovereignty claims, viewing East Jerusalem as occupied territory. The decades following reunification were marked by intense political, demographic, and cultural transformations. Israel invested heavily in infrastructure, housing, and municipal services, seeking to integrate East Jerusalem into the urban and administrative framework of the state. Roads, schools, utilities, and public institutions were expanded, yet these efforts often sparked controversy. Palestinians, many of whom remained in the city, experienced restrictions on movement, building permits, and political representation, fueling long-standing grievances that would feed the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Jerusalem became the symbolic and administrative heart of Israel, with government offices, the Knesset, and official residences concentrated in West Jerusalem. Yet the city's Palestinian population and its historical significance for Islam and Christianity created persistent tension. The city's sacred geography, Western Wall, Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Church of the Holy Sepulchre meant that any political or military action had immediate religious and international repercussions. Clashes over access, sovereignty, and religious rights erupted periodically, drawing global attention and often catalyzing wider regional conflicts. The intifadas of 1987 to 1993 and 2000 to 2005 dramatically underscored the city's contested nature. During these uprisings, Jerusalem's streets, checkpoints, and neighborhoods became arenas of protest, violence, and heightened security measures. Suicide bombings, demonstrations, and military responses shaped daily life, creating an environment where fear, resilience, and political assertion intertwined. Yet, even amidst conflict, life continued. Markets operated, schools functioned, and religious rituals persisted across communities. Jerusalem remained a city of faith and resistance, its sacred spaces and streets bearing witness to human devotion, suffering, and determination. International diplomacy continually reflected Jerusalem's unique status. Numerous peace plans, including the Oslo Accords and subsequent negotiations, grappled with its future. Proposals often envisioned shared governance, division of neighborhoods, or international oversight of holy sites, highlighting the city's unparalleled religious and symbolic weight. Jerusalem was not merely a political entity, but a global symbol of identity, memory, and aspiration, where historical claims and contemporary realities collided with extraordinary intensity. Throughout this period, Jerusalem underwent significant urban and demographic expansion. Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem were established, often on contested land, while Palestinian neighborhoods grew under constraints imposed by zoning laws and municipal policies. Infrastructure projects, roads, light rail, hospitals, and schools transformed the city's landscape. Yet the old city, with its medieval walls, narrow alleys, and sacred quarters, remained the spiritual core, a living testament to thousands of years of history. Pilgrims from around the world continued to visit, sustaining religious traditions and connecting contemporary Jerusalem to its ancient past. Culturally and socially, the city remained diverse and dynamic. Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side, sharing markets, institutions, and public spaces while navigating deep political divides. Jerusalem became a city of contrasts. Modern skyscrapers and government buildings rose alongside centuries-old synagogues, mosques, and churches. Festivals, rituals, and communal life persisted, reflecting continuity amidst upheaval. The city's identity was both ancient and contemporary, sacred and secular, contested and lived. Jerusalem's role in regional and international politics intensified during this period. United Nations resolutions, diplomatic missions, and international conferences repeatedly addressed the city's status, reflecting its position as a litmus test for broader peace in the Middle East. Controversial policies, including settlement expansion and restrictions on Palestinian development, elicited global criticism. Jerusalem's very streets, neighborhoods, and holy sites became arenas where local, national, and international conflicts intersected, amplifying its symbolic power far beyond its geographic size. By the early 21st century, Jerusalem had evolved into a city of memory, faith, and politics. Museums, memorials, and heritage sites preserve the narratives of their Jewish, Muslim, and Christian histories. Educational institutions, including universities and religious schools, fostered scholarship and debate. Yet the underlying conflicts persisted, as competing national claims and religious significance continued to define its character. Jerusalem remained a city where history was not merely remembered but actively contested, shaping the lives of residents and influencing the policies of governments worldwide. Entering the 2020s, Jerusalem remains a symbol of both hope and tension. Markets bustle, prayers rise from synagogues, churches, and mosques, and pilgrims arrive from across the globe. Yet the city remains at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a flashpoint for disputes over sovereignty, identity, and religious access. Its streets tell a story of destruction and reconstruction, exile and return, division and unity. The city's population has grown and its economy diversified, but the spiritual, symbolic, and political significance of Jerusalem ensures that it will always be more than a mere city. It is a living narrative of humanity's struggle with faith, power, and memory. As of 2025 CE, Jerusalem stands as a microcosm of history itself. Over 3 millennia, it has witnessed empires rise and fall, religions flourish and clash, and populations endure conquest, exile, and renewal. It is a city perpetually in flux, yet its identity remains remarkably resilient. Jerusalem is not just the capital of a modern nation. It is a palimpsest of civilizations, a crossroads of faiths, and a symbol of human yearning for meaning, security, and belonging. Its story continues to unfold, reminding the world that some cities are not merely lived in, they are experienced, remembered, and contested generation after generation.